Welcome to the Catholic Commission for Social Justice and the Archdiocese Ministry for Migrants and Refugees. So we're very excited to revamp Trinity TV's series, Ask Why. And ask why. Why is there poverty? Why is there injustice? Why do we have the issues we have in society? So we're going to really dive into this topic, especially with regards to social justice. So let's get started. So here with us, we have the ultimate social justice team. And when you hear that term social justice, you almost feel as though you're part of a superhero team. Well, I have some real life heroes that I am excited to introduce right now. People who have been fighting the fight and asking why. Why is there inequality within society for many, many, many years? So on that note, I'd like to introduce some key members of the Catholic Commission for Social Justice. We have our current chair, Ms. Leela Ramdeen, our incoming chair, Father Curtis Poyer, and the coordinator of the Archdiocese Ministry for Migrants and Refugees, Darrion, Narine. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us on our first episode of Ask Why. What is social justice? So let's delve right into it today. And we're going to start with Ms. Ramdeen. Leela, please tell us, what is social justice?
Justice, we want justice. No justice, no peace. How often have we heard this cry? This term has different interpretations depending on who is addressing the question. Let's consider the term justice within the context of a Catholic understanding of what the term social justice means. To understand the meaning of this term, we must turn to our scriptures, to the various encyclicals of our popes, starting with Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum on Labor and Capital in 1891. We need to look at other documents of the Magisterium, to our catechism, to the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. The classic understanding of justice is rendering, giving to every person his or her due. But what exactly is one's due? Unless we have a transcendent understanding of the human person, what some may consider to be a person's due could just be crumbs from their table. People are not things. Our catechism 3357 tells us that being made in the image of God, the human individual possesses the dignity of a person who is not just something, but someone. 1929 of the Catechism says, social justice can be obtained only in respecting the transcendent dignity of man and woman. So underpinning social justice is the respect for the human person and the rights which flow from the human dignity and guarantee from human dignity and guarantee it. 1929 tells us what is at stake is the dignity of the human person whose defense and promotion have been entrusted to us by the Creator. Let us remember that the dignity of the human person is first of all innate. Each of us is born with it, given to us by God. Inviolable, it cannot be violated. Inalienable, it cannot be taken away from us. Universal, it encompasses all humanity. How can we ensure social justice? 1928 of our catechism tells us society ensures social justice when it provides the conditions that allow associations or individuals to obtain what is their due according to their nature and their vocation. Social justice is linked to the common good and the exercise of authority. And 1931 says respect for the human person proceeds by way of respect for the principle that everyone should look upon his or her neighbor without exception as another self, above all bearing in mind his or her life and the means necessary for living it with dignity. This reminds us of the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Whatever we need to live our lives with dignity, for example, basic amenities, we should wish that for others too. 1932 tells us the duty of making oneself a neighbor to others and actively serving them becomes even more urgent when it involves the disadvantaged and in whatever area this may be. As you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. We read that in Matthew 25:40 on the last day of judgment. That's what Jesus will judge us on. 1938 says that there exist also sinful inequalities that affect millions of men and women. These are in open contradiction of the gospel. Their equal dignity as persons demands that we strive for fairer and more humane conditions. excessive economic and social disparity between individuals and peoples of the one human race is a source of scandal and militates against social justice, equity, human dignity, as well as social and international peace. It is important for us to focus on the fact that the teachings of our church are meant to help us to live as Jesus lived, to obey his commandments, so that we'll be able to live holy lives. Living the church's definition of social justice, therefore, is living as Jesus taught each of us to live. However, it's only when we truly have an encounter with Christ will we be able to see, judge, and act from a Catholic perspective and live as Christ's disciples. Pope Francis insists that true social justice is impossible if the human person is not the center of concern. He says guaranteeing justice for all men and women is not possible while a few people control most of the world's wealth and everyone else's right to a dignified life is disregarded. He said that building social justice is a collective work. It must be achieved on a daily basis because imbalance is a temptation at every minute. Working towards true social justice must be done with an attitude of commitment that follows along the path of the Good Samaritan, he says, and that is mindful of not falling into a culture of indifference. He always tells us warns us against the globalization of indifference. God asks us, he said, he asked believers to be God's people, not God's elite. God's call to justice in our scriptures is clear. You know, in the Bible, the word justice appears 328 times. I didn't count them, somebody else did. In Micah 6:8, we read, "This is what the Lord asks of you, only this, to act justly, to love tenderly, and to work humbly with your God." Amos 5:24, "Let justice flow like water and integrity like an unfailing stream." And in Isaiah 61, verse 1, "The Spirit of the Lord has been given to me, for he has anointed me. He has sent me to bring the good news to the poor, to bind up the hearts that are broken, to proclaim liberty to captives, freedom to those in prison, to comfort those who mourn. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and all that is wrong." And in James we read, "If a brother or sister has nothing to wear and has no food for the day, and one of you say to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and eat well,' but you do not give them the necessities of the body, what good is it? So also faith of itself, if it does not have works, if faith doesn't have works, it is dead." But why should we be concerned about social justice issues? Why can't we just seek a vertical relationship with God and let others look after the poor, the vulnerable, and those who face the brunt of injustices? Pope Francis says, none of us can think we are exempt from the concerns for the poor and social justice. Jesus tells us what the protocol is on which we will be judged. It is the one we read in chapter 25 of Matthew Gospel, which I just referred to. So although there's a relationship between charity and justice, they are not the same. Working for justice involves changing systems, structures, institutions, and public policies that are the root causes of injustices such as poverty and social exclusion. We have to move beyond charity and works of mercy to address systemic inequalities. Pope Francis says that solidarity is essential in the fight against poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Solidarity, he says, means fighting against a culture that can lead us to using others, to enslaving others, and ends up taking away the dignity of others. No one can remain insensitive to the inequalities that persist in the world, he says. Everybody, according to his or her particular opportunities and responsibilities, should be able to make a personal contribution to end so many social injustices. The culture of selfishness and individualism that often prevails in our society is not what will build up a habitable world. Rather, it's a culture of solidarity that will do so. St. John Paul II reminded us that the social message of the gospel must not be considered a theory, but a basis for action. Today, more than ever, the church is aware that her social message will gain credibility more from the witness of actions than as a result of its logic and consistency. So how do we move from belief and be witnesses? That's the fundamental requirement of our faith, as we see in Matthew 25 and James 2. Yet how do we do this? How can we be salt of the earth and light of the world? How can we be a leaven in society? So let's look briefly at the See Judge Act process, which helps us to walk with the 2 feet of social action, works of mercy and promoting systemic change. That method was created by Cardinal Joseph Cardine, even though its roots can be found in Thomas Aquinas' description of the intellectual virtue of prudence. We're called to apply key Catholic social justice teaching principles to various contemporary situations. Pope St. John the 23rd said in his encyclical 1961 encyclical Mater et Magistra, he identifies the process of seeing, judging, and acting as the way we should proceed. See Judge Act is also the foundational pastoral method of Pope Francis in Laudato Si. In it, he appropriates that See Judge Act method for theological reflection of and interpretation of the reality, the signs of the times, with the goal of acting to transform our world. In Laudato Si, he describes the methodological practice he uses to construct his theological argument. Francis says he begins by reviewing, by seeing the best scientific research today. And then he judges principles from Judeo-Christian tradition. In light of his theological reflection, he then advances dialogue and action, examples of what we can do, both on an individual and global level. This 3-step process presents, as he said, a praxis-oriented methodology that prioritizes a critical assessment of reality. So, for example, in chapter 1 of Laudato Si, he engages in interpretations of scientific analysis in order to describe what is happening to our common home. That's the seeing. He then moves to step 2 with a theological reflection on the gospel of creation. And he reminds readers that dialogue between science and faith can produce fruitful dialogue. We can't only look at science, we have to bring in religion. It includes religion because we have something to offer. Then he moves on to make concrete recommendations for action to protect and promote our common home. So our church outlines clearly what social justice is and gives us the tools to see, judge, and act. Now let us go forth and live as Christians, as Christ wants us to live, acting justly to build his kingdom of justice, peace, truth, love, freedom, and forgiveness. Thank you.
Leela, thank you. That was so beautifully comprehensive. And I'm pulling so much wisdom, so many jewels out of that. You know, we are here as social justice to transform ourselves as the individual and transform the collective by witnessing what structures, what needs to change within and without. Father Poyer, I'm going to come to you next, and you always have a very interesting term. You refer to social justice as social justice. So what is the role of social justice in doing this?
Hello, Dominique. Thanks for your interview. So just a compliment on something that Leela was saying at the beginning and to go forward with your question. So the term social justice was coined by the Jesuit philosopher Luigi Taparelli in the first half of the 19th century. He was one of the founders of the prestigious Jesuit University in Rome, the Gregorian University. So if you think of the image of Lady Justice, so Lady Justice is blindfolded and she has the scales in her hands where it has to be balanced. So justice means fairness. So the idea of using social justice was that up until that time, justice was only conceived in 2 forms, of the individual towards the state and the state towards the individuals. That is, law was only conceived in terms of private law, which comes from the whole Roman tradition, or it was considered as public law, the idea of government towards people. But what about different groups in society who we can't consider just as one person, but an entire group of people? So where the judgments is not just about one person, it's about an entire group like workers or women or Jews. That's where he coined that term social justice. It's fairness for social groups in the society. Now, unfortunately, that concept was not taken up until after the Second World War, when the Charter of Human Rights was made after 1948. Then you had 3 generations of rights. So in the 3rd generation, when they talk about human rights, they talk about social rights. So that was retaking the concept of social justice 100 years before, more than 100 years before, where the idea was, what about the Jews then? If Hitler and the Nazis went against the Jews, the idea of the Jews being a social group, but there are all kinds of social groups. So you have women who struggled for workers' rights as women in Chicago, and you have workers' movements all over the world who are not only inspired by Marxist movements, but are inspired by concepts of biblical justice and Roman law, of canon law, Roman canon law, which developed over the centuries. So the idea of fairness for different groups in society is, what is social justice about? Social fairness for these different groups who may be disadvantaged or their rights may not be taken into account. So the idea of social justice is to try to move forward with their rights, to see that their rights are enshrined in legal systems and to see that they are protected. Now, of course, where the idea of social justice ministry means to say that there's some social work that has to do, that has to be done before you can actually change systems, or you can actually modify laws or see that laws are enforced or enacted. The laws may be there, but it may be that nobody is taking it on. So the two things have to be done. You have to see if there are within these groups, these individual social groups, if they do not have what they need to subsist and to survive and to move forward, then that's where the social work and charity comes in. Charity understood not only as for just one person, but for a group like migrants, for instance. When we talk about justice for migrants and refugees, we are really talking about social justice. That's an example of it, which is what Darrion will talk about, I guess, after I speak. And so the idea is that you do have to do work with individuals and with families and with groups to try to help them to raise their level of existence. That's where the social part of it comes in. But where the social justice comes in is that as a group, you need to modify policies, or if the policies were already enshrined in a legal system of a country or part of it, you have to make sure that it is enacted so that it can protect their rights, it can promote their rights, where those rights are not being observed or trampled on. So that is what we mean by social justice ministry and what we mean by social justice in itself. Now, the idea that that in Quadragesimo Anno, the second social encyclical, where for the first time the concept of social justice was used, it was used in a sense that the original Jesuit philosopher Luigi da Parelli used it, which is good. That's a continuity. And then it was taken on from there. It became a subject of study at universities and at research institutions, social research institutions. And now everybody speaks about it, So I can say that for the moment. Thanks very much for your question.
Poyer. And this is where I'm going to introduce Darrion. And Darrion, I would like you to speak from two perspectives. One, being the coordinator of the Archdiocese Ministry for Migrants and Refugees, but also both Leela and Father Poyer spoke to the idea that social justice goes deeper. It goes to systemic change. And this is one of your fortes, governance and governance structures. But beyond that, you are a youth. Darrion is such a wise old soul deep down that you forget how young he is. But the reality is your generation is pushing the world forward right now. So what is the role of social justice for you?
Thanks a lot, Dominic, and happy to be here, sharing as well amongst some of the greats in social justice within the Catholic Church. I'm glad that we're talking a little bit here about systemic change as well. When we examine social justice and when we look at social justice, a big part of it comes down to not only our governance systems, but also our cultural systems as well. Because what has been happening across the board and across the globe is that social justice has taken on different iterations based on which culture it exists within, right? And then that begs the overall question that a lot of people are raising to the fore, which is there a global social justice? Are there principles that are global? The answer to that is, of course, yes, right? We know within our Catholic Church, there are systems, there are social justice principles that are global. But the way in which these are adapted across different cultures could be and could prove to be quite different as well. And I think that is where our discussion needs to take place and needs to occur and happen. Even if you localize it, let's bring it down into our context here within Trinidad and Tobago, within the Caribbean region. The way in which we internalize what is just and what is not just and what is right and what is not right, it is different within different communities. And I have seen it, you know, let's and we can deconstruct one idea around justice as well. And one issue around discrimination, and that's the whole idea of racism, right? If you deconstruct that, the way in which people interpret what is just and what is not just with a racial lens on is completely different, and is not because they in their own minds they don't think they're racist. You know, you have people like that. So you have people who know that they are racist, whatever, they've accepted that. Yeah, they've said I'm this is my way, I'm going to do this thing, and they know, right? So they have no excuse for them, right? But there are people who are just blatantly ignorant because of the culture that they grew up with, how they were raised, how they grew, right? And you've seen, when you're talking about youth to of course the older generation as well, you see it. I have friends who have a totally different mindset to their grandparents, right? And when you're having discussions with them, sometimes you just have to laugh, right? And Father Poyer would know this, would know that he always says that sometimes within injustice, you have to laugh to yourself a little bit so that you don't take it too seriously, so that you don't get no set of, oh God, Leela, sorry, yeah, but so that you don't get no stroke, you know, inside there as well. And that has oftentimes been raised, you know. But what I'm getting at here is the fact that within different cultures and within different generations, the way in which we approach social justice tends to be different. The way in which we see social justice tends to be different, right? When you look at the comments between a younger generation and an older generation when it comes to race relations, it tends to be a bit different. The way in which they talk, the way in which they move. Even when you watch gender, you look at gender, the whole idea of how a woman is supposed to behave for somebody in their 70s is completely different to somebody in their 20s. You know, the way in which we approach these different topics and these different things inside there as well. So what I'm looking at is, of course, a culture shift that needs to take place first and foremost. And then after culture is when you approach governance. One of the things that I oftentimes talk to people about is the fact that we say we're going to just bring in a whole set of young people into the political system and throw over the political system and change it, and we're going to just stamp out corruption and everything going to be irie because young people are going to come and just change the whole world, right? And I watch these people and I laugh because the truth of the matter is, if you have a culture that's already ingrained inside there, even if you throw out everybody and you bring in a fresh slate of people, if the culture is not being changed, is not being adjusted, right, then what's going to happen is that those people are going to come in and just adopt the same principles. And you see it, George Orwell, he had that book, right, Animal Farm, and it showed exactly that. The people come, they change the whole system, and then they adopt the system, because at the end of the day, when you're looking at culture is a study of both power and politics. So at the end of the day, when we get into the political, it's a contestation of power inside there, and people have an attraction to power, right? People naturally gravitate towards wanting this power over and dominion over other people. But of course, we know that true dominion only comes from God, right? God is overall, sees over all of us, and that is why the way in which I would say the best way to approach that whole culture shift, that whole new approach to our societal issues, etc., is of course to look at our Catholic social teaching and doctrines, because education is a tool of liberation, and ingraining that into our wider society, spreading that knowledge into our wider society can truly target the real issues that we have out there, right? And that is how you move towards that culture shift. We have to ingrain not only a moral compass, but also a spiritual compass inside there as well, to the people who we have interacting and working within different realms across our globe, right? My globe in the back there, but also who are working specifically within social justice. And to me, that is where our systemic change comes from. So change of culture would then lead to a change in our governance, could then lead to more just social justice principles. And that change in culture must be a spiritual change in culture, a moral change in culture, and an educational change in culture. So that is where I stand with regards to systemic, social justice issues and targeting that inside there.
I have a question for all of you. So remember, we're talking to the community on Trinity TV viewing and listening in right now. So, and what you said there, so all of us are created equal, but some are more equal than others, a reference to Animal Farm. And we see that within Trinidad and Tobago. We see a system within the world in which, we have the top 5% and then everybody else, not so much, but arguably what you speak to, Darrion, even though beautiful, are we running out of time? We're in a situation where people need to wake up now. So what do we say to the wider Catholic community viewing who doesn't have the time to go through an education system? Because what you speak to is a systematic change that takes many years, generations even, but we don't have the time. We have to act now. What do we say to these wider the Catholic community?
Can I just say, from my perspective, our Catholics in Trinidad and Tobago love the Bible. They love the scriptures. And my message, to really understand what justice means from a Catholic perspective, read your scriptures, read the parables. That's what Pope Francis said in my quotation about the Good Samaritan. Read Matthew 25. What is it that God said? When I was hungry, where were you? You didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, when I was in prison, you didn't visit me. Those are, how do we instill virtues and values in our people? And that's to instill virtues and values. That's why we have created this wonderful ebook, starting with Gisela, on virtues. As a parent, what are the virtues and values you're instilling in your children? That's how we get social justice. That's how you'll be able to act. Because when you're faced with an issue, you'll remember what you were taught by the Catholic community, by your parents. Yeah. So see, judge, and act. You have to draw on what you know. As Darrion said, the culture. And that culture involves your upbringing, how you lived. When you go to church and you come out of church and you see people walking in the rain and you just wave with your glass up and your AC. How does the Catholic Church teach you to do that? It doesn't. So my message is, read the scriptures. Read what we're supposed to do when we see our neighbor in need. Who is our neighbor? Anyone, Jesus says, who is in need. So to me, that is, we haven't got time to change, as you're saying, to educate the whole world, but we have time to read our scriptures, which our own Archbishop and the Pope keep talking about. In fact, for the season of creation, remember the Pope says, go back to Genesis, read your scriptures. We're not supposed to dominate the world, nature, as we're doing and trampling on it. We're supposed to till and cultivate the earth. That's what Genesis tells us. So in my view, we can start by reminding Catholics of, how we're supposed to live. If we want to live as Jesus tells us, live as a holy person, go back to our scriptures.
That is very sage advice. Thank you, Leela. Father Poyer, did you want to add anything to that in terms of how our community tuning in right now can actively live social justice in their immediate worlds?
So one of the important things is to be aware of the different social problems that we live in. So our viewers on Trinity TV, who may be mostly Catholic, although not exclusively so, we may not have had that as part of our Catholic upbringing in terms of the kind of masses that we attend. Those issues may have only been lightly talked about coming from the readings, because biblical interpretation, as Leela was saying, is not just about reading, it's also about interpreting the scriptures. Might not have had so much of that in it, although some of it, of course. And but exactly in terms of how to systematically view our social problem together with others and how they interact and how we can be fair to different social groups without trampling the rights of other groups. Those are things that we need as Catholics to be much more aware of. One of the other things that we need to be aware of in the modern world that we live in is how modern democracies use social justice to advance party political lines. So one group, one political group may say, hey, let's work on social justice, but by that they mean social justice for their group. And they mean working at it, but they will not take into account, or they will deny that some other group might also have some issues which might be either in conflict with that. So exactly how to be fair and how to balance it, that's something that we as Catholics have to think of. We have to be much, much broader in our thinking that we grew up. Now, so Darrion mentioned, of course, the educational systems. So educational systems are flawed in that sense, because many educational systems follow political systems, which are divided in any case, and teach us to be divided. They don't teach us how to, that are my social justice for me and for my group, or for some group that I might be concerned about. Let's take the issue of migrants and refugees. So discrimination against migrants in Caribbean society might come about because you may see that these people from Latin America may be invading my country. They may be using resources which should be given to me, they're given to them. So there are perceptions which forge discrimination against migrants and refugees. And that's all over the world where you have lived, in the States, in England, you have seen that, right? Mm-hmm. So people who think that they have a natural right to be there, anybody else coming in, they will say, well, look, you are not supposed to come here. So we have all that. As Catholics, we have to be aware of the complexity of the different social problems that we are aware of. There are no simple solutions. That is why the solutions cannot just come from one person. It has to be done through networking. That is, we have to pool different ideas and different experiences. We have to bring them together to try to see if that can bear some light on some particular problem. Mm-hmm. Now, the broadening of our own thinking and of our own perspectives, that will help us, where Darrion was talking about broadening our education, broadening our understanding, and therefore broadening the way in which we understand social problems and social concepts and how we address it. We as Catholics, of course, we have 2 or 3 areas that or resources, as it were, to help us. One is our scriptures. So we have to, in terms of modern interpretation of the Bible, there's so much being done and has been done in the last 200 years, but especially in the last 50 years, the amount of work that has been done on biblical interpretation can really illuminate us on so many things. So that's one. Second, we have Catholic social teaching and the different theologies that has emerged from the Third World. which can broaden our own concept. And third of all, we do have our own experiences that we can count on. So what Darrion was saying, going back to his experiences, he was saying that when he goes from community to community, if you listen carefully to his analysis, there's something there. When you go from community to community, you realize that that one community has one concept of social justice that is different from the concept of social justice in another community. And that is because of politics. Politics has divided us so much, and politicians are very, very astute in using people and using their ignorance or the limitedness of their own vision, or they're very astute in terms of trying to help us say, hey, the other is evil. We are good. We are the good guys, right? The other is evil. So we as Catholics, we have to go way, way, way beyond that. We have to step back from that, as it were, and try to see things from a different perspective. Fortunately, the Pope Francis, instead of being a very, very broad theoretical guy, he is very pointed in terms of individual experiences and how they can work in different situations. He has that deep vision coming out of his own experience from Argentina and from other places, and you could see it. So he has a certain understanding. Instead of giving, like the popes before him, a broad, overarching kind of guiding principles, sometimes he pinpoints experiences which can work, which can help us to reflect or to see things in a different angle.
Can I just add to what Father said? When you talk and Darrion about culture, people's culture and how they perceive the world and their communities and the government from their own cultural background. CCSJ held a webinar last year on racism. Well, it was after the election, where it was very bruising election in terms of race and comments being made. And Professor Rhoda Reddock from UE was one of our speakers, and also Rosemary Bella Antwine, who was the Dean of the legal faculty at UE. And Professor Reddock rightly says, we see everything through the lens of race in our country. And I know that growing up as a mixed person, we see everything through the lens of race. And that is sad. How can we create a community when, one certain ethnic groups only see themselves as the ones who should get from the pie? Nobody else should get a piece of this pie. And that's not going to help us to build community. And yet, as the Calypsonian said, we don't vote as we party. So at carnival time, every ethnic group jumping up together. But you come election time, and that race, and then of course it permeates through society in all that we do. So that to me is one of the major social justice issues we have to address. And that also is inextricably linked to poverty and social exclusion, including some of the very people who are voting for certain parties, who then fall within poverty and social exclusion, but will not see beyond race to see what am I due? Eh? I voting all this time for these, what am I getting my due? So we need to look at race and how that could keep people down, but divide communities.
And that actually is a nice call to action, because we can all, to use the See, Judge, Act framework, we could all see, we know what's happening in our society, in our world. And we've taken the time here to judge through the lens of the Catholic Church. Thank you, everybody, for your amazing and very wise perspectives, but referenced in some very deep, pertinent theology. And now we must act. And I love the idea of bringing in what you had said, Father Poyer, that Catholics now need to take a step back. We now need to be truly Catholic and be universal in our lens and our perspective. But we can do it, as you've rightly said, Leela. We all have that lens of racism, which was brought in and honed in by Darrion, the youth voice, because it's still very much there. So how do we act? How do we act now? And maybe we can start by removing that lens of race. But I'm gonna, in terms of a call to action, Darrion, I'm gonna throw this one to you because we have run out of time, I'm sorry to say, but I want everybody to throw out their call to action at this point. Let's leave the community of Trinidad and Tobago with something that we can actionably do with regards to social justice. Darrion, what do you think?
So my father always used to tell me that sometimes the only gospel that people will ever read is the gospel of your own life, right? And that's something I think is very prolific, because a lot of people don't read the Bible, but they will act based on what you do and how you do it and how you move. So it's very important that we take ownership of our own behaviors, of our own actions, and that we become mindful of it as well, so that we bring that to the fore. So we're constantly dealing with ourselves and developing ourselves and listening to what other people say about us as well, and our shortcomings and our failures, and try to improve upon that with the grace of God.
Beautiful and wise. Thank you, Darrion. Leela, call to action. What do you think?
My call to action is that each of us should reflect on our own. Archbishop Edward Gilbert, when he was here, when we were creating the booklets, the program for virtues and values for all our primary schools, in his introduction to the booklet, he reminded us that it's our own action, it's our own witness to Christ that counts in the end. So I want us each to reflect on, am I a true witness as a Catholic? When I, in my home, in my workplace, and on the street, how am I judge means your thought, word, and action. What are my thought processes? When I pass on the street and I see what we call a vagrant or a socially displaced person, how do I feel? How do I act? What can I do? Can I write a letter to the councillor, the MP, the prime minister, So for me, what I reflect on is, am I living as a Christian, as a Catholic? And what else can I do to improve how I live, to be more like Christ?
Beautiful, beautiful. Father Poyer.
Okay, so one of the things that I hope to be doing is to try to help to work with the migrant community in terms of their understanding of biblical interpretation, and to help them to further contribute to Trinidad and Tobago and Caribbean society. And in fact, they have to work out their own liberation in this sense, that they have to be able to show the countries that host them that they're not there just to consume their resources, but they're also there to contribute to the positive development of the countries, of the hosting countries. And that will help the people who they found when they arrived to accept them even better. But it's a process, right? So that their perspective can change in that sense. So that needs to be done. Then you do have Catholics who have mental health challenges, in the sense that they don't seem to understand what's really happening. And those things too need to be addressed. Leela was just mentioning vagrants. And I remember the first time I walked the streets of pastoral New York. You see all these vagrants on the streets, street people. And I thought that they were just people who were evicted from their homes, only to discover that many of them are veterans from the different wars and conflicts and so on. And who, when they try to get back into society, they simply just can't do it. So they turn to drugs and other kinds of lifestyles, which make them on the fringes and on the margins of society. So that is another group that we need to look at. It's a whole challenge. So there are many things for us as Catholics to think about and to do, and some of it we are already doing, which is good, but we need to build it, strengthen it, amplify it, expand it, talk about it, think about it, talk fairly about it, openly about it, and try to discover where our own discriminatory practices are, and deal with it, and try to go against it and to change it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This was a really wonderful and jam-packed session in terms of its content and the depth of content about what is social justice and what is our role as individuals and collective society in bridging and coming together in this universality that is truly Catholicism. So I would like to say thank you to everybody. Of course, we have lots of materials online where you can access even more information on what is social justice. Please check out our website, rcsocialjustice.org, well, www.rcsocialjustice.org, as well as our Facebook page, CCSJ Trinidad and Tobago, where we will have ebooks, which you can take away to learn more about what is social justice. Thank you, team. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for joining us today. And make sure to tune in to our second episode of Ask Why on Trinity TV. Wishing everyone a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.